Welcome to the Secure Connections podcast, brought to you by IoT, the Internet of Things Security Services Association. My name is Brian Sherman, and as content director for IoT, I get the pleasure of hosting today's session with our special guest, Luis Alvarez, President and CEO of Alvarez Technology Group. Welcome to the Secure Connections podcast, Luis.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to having an interesting conversation.
Fantastic. Well, we appreciate you taking time out of your day to share your insight and some of your expertise. And today we're going to dive into some interesting areas of IoT. Obviously, that's one of the focal points for the association, and we definitely appreciate you taking your time to give kind of your own unique insight into the opportunities for the channel. Let's first off, you're a new guest to the podcast. Let's discuss your background first. How did you ever get into IoT? Or into IT in general?
Well, right out of high school, I joined the Air Force because I didn't want to go to school. Thought I'd take a 2-year or 4-year sabbatical and then come back and go to college. It ended up that when you join the Air Force, you go to a lot of school. So I ended up spending 2 years learning to be an Intel language interpreter, and then spent about 8 years in Berlin. And while I was there, I was exposed to computers for the first time in my life. This was, not something most of us back then had like we do today everywhere. I mean, this was big, giant green screen type things. And I figured out that I really enjoyed technology. And over time, the Air Force started purchasing these things called the IBM PC. This was the mid-'80s, and they bought these boxes that the real IS guys, the MIS department said, no, we're not going to handle that. Somebody else has to handle that. And so they ended up assigning me the additional duty of babysitting and learning all there was to know about these things called PCs. And that was really my first introduction to information technology at that level. And then when I left active duty, I got a job working at a computer company, a very small kind of build your own. We made a lot of clone PCs. If you remember the 286s and 386s and 486s, remember that whole world. And went to school, got certified, and over time just decided that this was really my passion. I loved building solutions. And so I've been doing this since, 1990, and that's a long time to be in technology, especially given how much it's changed during that, that 30 some odd years that I spent working in my first company that we then sold in 1999. And then I stuck around with the company that acquired us for a couple of years and decided that I wanted to strike out on my own. So in 2000, I started Alvarez Technology Group, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you for your service too, because it's something that obviously I think we appreciate is those that contribute their time. But the nice part is it also gave you a skill, or hopefully Absolutely. A passion too within technology. So that's fantastic. Sometimes we overlook all the opportunities that there are in the military. And seeing a lot of the kids, especially today now with 3D and drones, there's a tremendous amount of technology options for them too. It'll be interesting to see what happens in another 15 or 20 years when they're building their own businesses outside too.
It's funny how I run into a lot of former vets or former active duty guys, vets in this career field or this industry. It just seems to attract a lot of people who were, either Air Force or Navy, Army, or Marines. So it's fun to run into those folks and have conversations around our shared experiences.
Yeah, well, even in the cybersecurity community too, because I think you learn to be very regimented and following directions and looking for process. So that seems to be, if you're hire good technical people to train up, military is a great way to go. We've seen that from many of the vendors too. In the industry making the recommendation. So let's take a step back. You mentioned beginning your own business. Can you give us an overview of what you do, including the communities your team supports?
Sure. So we're based in Salinas, California. Salinas, California is most recognized because it's where John Steinbeck wrote most of his stories. If you read East of Eden or any of Cannery Row, any of those, it was right here on the central coast of California in what we call Monterey County. And it's a very ag-rich community. That is, it produces about 70% of the leafy greens that are eaten across the country. So, head lettuce, romaine, things like that. Unfortunately, that means sometimes we get on the news for the bad reasons, like E. coli or salmonella. But
Right.
It's interesting to me. Most people think of farming and they don't really equate technology to it. But farmers have to innovate and have always been innovating since the beginning of farming, because they need to do everything they can to increase their yields while reducing their costs, and that means that this is a very tech-rich area. We're only 50 miles south of Silicon Valley, but I always say we might as well be 5,000 miles away because it's so different. Once you drive up the highway past all the ag lands and the wine fields, and you run into the concrete jungle that is Silicon Valley. But we're very different, and the tech needs here are different. So when I set up our company here, I knew that agriculture was going to be a big part of our client base. They are the largest employers, some of the most well-to-do companies here, and they invest in technology. They're not shy about investing when they can see a return on that investment. And back in the day when we first started, we were started as an IT service provider, eventually morphed into a managed services provider. Now we call ourselves a technology services provider, because managed services means different things to different people. And really, we span the gamut of traditional IT all the way to IoT and cloud, and security is a big part of our focus now. It has to be for any technology provider out there. If you're not focused on security, you're going to be putting yourself and your clients at risk. And so we've evolved and continue to evolve as the technology evolves. And so for the most part, we support mid to small size companies throughout California. And most recently have started working in a brand new industry that just started about 3 years ago, cannabis. As California approved recreational use, that has meant an exploding industry and a lot of opportunity for technology providers.
Fantastic. Now, one thing I noticed is this is your 20th year of operations. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. That is correct. 20 years of continuous operation. We started, it was just me when we first got hung up the shingle, so to speak, and now we're up to about 34, 35 people.
That's awesome.
And we have folks that work here in Salinas, but we also have remote folks from Nashville, Memphis, Vancouver, Washington, all sorts of places. It's interesting. People that have come through our doors that then moved on to other areas of the country that want to continue to still work for us. And we appreciate that, and it means that we're a good company.
Right, definitely. Now, agriculture is always interesting too, because for those that know Arlen Sorensen and HTG, and those that have been really knee deep in the technology aspect of farming, even in my own area, farming is, the community I live in, the largest job source, and we're more grapes in this part of the country, not the wine grapes, but the sweet grapes. But the technology that's being deployed is just amazing, and I don't think a lot of the normal people in IT have taken a lot of time to look at the things that are available. Can you kind of give us an overview of some of the technologies that you provide to the farming community?
Sure. Well, as I said, farmers and the farming community in general has had to innovate. Originally, it was to try to reduce costs. That was the big driver of, hey, how do we produce more stuff and reduce the cost of producing that stuff? But more and more, it's a matter of lack of labor. The labor situation in the country is pretty tight, and especially given all the issues around immigration right now. A lot of the traditional agricultural workers aren't coming to the United States, and so that means that these guys that have been depending on human labor now are looking at a lot of at automation to do the same sorts of things that they've done before. So they're investing quite a bit. When we first started, it was interesting because we weren't really paying attention to this thing called IoT. We were just focused on traditional, back office technology. Occasionally, one of our clients would call us and say, "Hey, we need a block of IP addresses." And we'd ask why, and they say, "Well, we're putting in some new sensors or doing something new in the warehouse, and we just need IP addresses." And that started about 10 years ago. And after a while, I started to think, there's something going on here that I need to get more involved in. We usually left that part of their business alone. But I recognized that they were adding more and more of these devices, and they were having an impact on the network infrastructure that we were managing. And because these were a lot of siloed solutions, the warehouse manager would go to some convention where he'd learn about a new pallet tracking system. So he would come back and say, "I want to implement this." Really not involve IT or involve us. Same thing with the guys who were trying to figure out how to be more efficient irrigating the fields and trying to reduce the water consumption, because that's another big issue here in California, is starting to reduce water consumption. And they would go out and find these solutions and, again, implement them without our input until the end, when they'd say, "Hey, we need Wi-Fi out on this field." And we'd say, "Well, it's not that easy. We can't do that today. We need to plan this a little bit." So we started to become much more actively involved in those communities, starting to join a lot of ag tech groups that were being formed locally by farmers to try to deal with automation and technology. Learned a lot, found some interesting new vendors that we partnered with that we could bring into our clients to help them with things like managing their greenhouses or managing or monitoring nitrates flows. All these really intricate things that most IT guys don't ever think about because they aren't PCs and they aren't servers. And that's what got us into IoT.
And I was doing some research on. I looked ahead of time on agriculture, IoT and agriculture, and Markets had an interesting report that they expect the market to be 4.3 billion by 2023, which is only 3 years away, and the annual growth rate is more than 19%, which, if you look at any technology area, is pretty phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
But that's only one component too. And going back to farming, I think it's too easy to put the focus on saying, okay, what can we put technology-wise in a tractor? But to your point, it goes much beyond that too. It's the greenhouses, the barns, the silos. There's a lot of different moving parts to a farm. I think that I'm assuming that you're looking at automation opportunities in like their entire business.
Yeah. So you mentioned tractors. An interesting story there is about 8-9 years ago, one of our clients that grows leafy greens, they primarily organic lettuces and kale and things like that, partnered with John Deere to develop a GPS control tractor. And the idea behind it was John Deere had been doing this in the Midwest quite a bit. But in the Midwest, you have these massive open fields that are pretty square. It's pretty easy to do. Here in the Salinas Valley, you have really odd-shaped parcels. They might be 40 acres or 80 acres, but they're long and narrow and have all sorts of twists and turns. So it was a lot more difficult problem to solve. But if they could solve it, it would be a huge boon for this industry, because at the time, tractor drivers who were good were paid a pretty healthy wage, and they were hard to find because these guys knew how to keep the tractor going in the right direction and do all the things that made those fields the most efficient producers of produce. Well, now they've solved that problem. John Deere helped automate that whole process. So now anybody can sit in the back of that tractor, do nothing, because the tractor is driving itself. And they're just there basically to turn the thing off and turn it on. And it's reduced the cost of production quite a bit, which falls right to the bottom line of those farmers. And we were involved right from the beginning of that process, trying to understand, well, how do we get the data from this tractor to where it needs to go? Because most of these farms, these places where they were going to be using this technology, didn't have a lot of connectivity back then. So, even cell service was spotty. So we had to come up with some very innovative ways to provide them wireless communications so that project could actually, pardon the pun, bear fruit.
What other type of applications? I know you mentioned, farming in general and then cannabis. Can you go into depth on the type of IoT focused solutions you're providing?
Oh, absolutely. So the cannabis industry is really interesting because one of the things that the Salinas Valley is known for, back before NAFTA was approved, was the cut flower industry. They used to grow, the roses that you would bring your wife on Valentine's Day, which is not that far away.
If you remember, yeah. Make sure you remember this week.
Yeah. So all these cut flowers were grown in Salinas and shipped all over the country. But then NAFTA came around and it became cheaper to bring in cut flowers from Central and South America. So all of these greenhouses that had been used for that particular industry suddenly were idle, and they were sitting around not being used. A lot of these families didn't know what to do with these greenhouses. Well, when California approved the recreational use of cannabis, they stipulated that it had to be grown indoors. Well, those greenhouses became super hot commodities. But again, they've been sitting around for about 30 years, so they needed a lot of retrofitting. So we got involved with some of our existing smaller cannabis clients who were now going big, if you will, and they bought a bunch of greenhouses, so we needed to add LED lighting. We needed to add environmental control systems. We partnered with companies that were doing the water filtration systems, companies that were providing soil measurement tools and things like that. And in the process, we were also creating backbones of traditional IT systems that needed to support these things, whether they were Wi-Fi or fiber. We needed to create an infrastructure where none existed. And then lastly, we got involved in access control and surveillance, because that's another part of the cannabis use or cannabis regulations in California that require pretty extensive surveillance, so that basically no part of the facility where cannabis is being grown or stored can be isolated or not on camera. So that created an opportunity for us to get into something new that we hadn't really been active in. So we learned a lot about the surveillance systems, the regulations around it, became experts, if you will. And so other cannabis growers from outside the region, from as far north as Northern California and into Palm Desert and Palm Springs, started calling on us to help them set those systems up.
So with these systems, you're collecting a lot of data, and I would assume you're also managing a fair amount of data, especially on the security side. In addition, what goes into that thought process, Luis?
Well, that was one of the more interesting things, because early on, what we found was that the traditional surveillance camera people, the folks that you would normally go to that would put in cameras in stores and retail places, they really weren't using next generation technology. They were sticking to their tried and true coax and barrel cameras and things like that. But the regulations called for essentially high definition video to be streamed and stored for up to 90 days. And that's a ton of storage. Yeah. So in the old way of doing things, what you found is that some of these early adopters of surveillance systems for cannabis had rooms and rooms of hard drive storage that they were just using to try to capture all this data. And we looked at it from the standpoint of, well, we don't have an investment in anything legacy. So what's the best technology out there that we can find to serve our clients? And we started partnering with companies like Tyco and Dawa and Hikvision, who had developed algorithms and compression methods that would allow you to store a significant amount of data in much smaller form factors. And so we brought that to the table, and we're providing next generation solutions, whereas the traditional surveillance companies were just kind of using what they knew, and they were afraid to adopt anything new because they weren't really coming from the IT space. They were looking at it from more the OT space. And we were just willing to try anything to solve the problem. And now we have some great new partnerships with vendors that we never would have worked with previously, and now we're expanding those relationships to go outside of the cannabis industry, because surveillance has now become a big part of pretty much every industry's need. We're working with schools, we're working with retail centers, event venues to create surveillance systems that are not just high def, but also can integrate with AI to help them identify issues and problems. Also, cloud storage so that we can get off-prem a lot of the video, because everybody knows that if there's a DVR and you steal the DVR, you got all the video. So you need to find a way to take it off site somehow. So that's presented us a bunch of new opportunities that we otherwise wouldn't ever explore.
So a lot of IoT, though, it sounds like is you're collecting the information mostly for efficiency too. I would assume that you're trying to use a minimal amount of water, and other resources, keep the temperature to the right with a right percentage without utilizing a ton of gas or whatever else they use to heat. That way, it might be solar.
Yeah.
But and then you're collecting all this information. What about the security side of things too? What type of precautions do they need to take for the cannabis industry, other than the access control parts that you talked about? Is there any IT security requirements?
Oh, absolutely. Cannabis companies are the primary targets by cyber criminals, primarily because they know it's still kind of I wouldn't call it sketchy industry, but at a federal level, these companies can't, for example, get cyber insurance. Because insurance companies won't provide that. They can't do federally backed banking, so they have to do local banking, use state sanctioned credit unions and those sorts of things. So it presents some challenges that the cyber criminals know that they can exploit. So we work really closely with our cannabis clients to impress upon them that it's not just the physical security that they need to worry about; it's their cybersecurity, protecting that data and protecting that information. We like to, our tagline is making our clients safe, secure, and successful. And what that means for us is we don't use any technology that doesn't have security as a fundamental component of it. So there's a company, for example, called Priva that is made its name in greenhouses, providing data. Excuse me. They made their name in greenhouses providing data analytics for watering systems. Their old systems were completely unsecure, really easy to hack into, really easy to they were built 30 years ago and it wasn't really a concern. Their new systems are much more security focused. They use traditional IP technology as opposed to their older PLCs. And so we've worked with them to make sure that the deployments that we've been involved in are as secure as they can be. And our next mission is to try to start tying all of this data together, because what we found is there's a lot of point solutions, right? Somebody can develop something for water monitoring, or monitoring the facility, or monitoring temperature, but bring all that data together so you can start doing some real analytics in terms of correlating what's the best conditions to grow plants that will provide the highest yields. You can only do that if you can take all of these different bits of data and compare them and figure that out.
That's interesting. I know I have a lot of friends that are still in the farming industry. Again, it's grapes, but two of them just had sent their kids to college or agricultural school, and it's interesting how many IT and cybersecurity and application classes they're taking now, because they realize that it's all about the efficiency and the control of their fields to make sure that they're getting a healthy harvest using the least amount of resources. So it's very interesting on how that whole industry has shifted over the last, I'd say, 20 years in particular. But it's interesting.
And to me, it's like we're at that stage in agriculture. We're at that stage where the automobile industry was about 20 years ago, when they started to realize, hey, we need to put more robots in our facilities, and we need to train our people to manage the robots, not to put doors on cars. The robots can put the doors on cars.
Sure.
And so, we're seeing a lot of automation go into farming now, and these farming companies realize that they need smarter people that are trained to manage the automation and not just manage the fields anymore, because the fields are being done by robots. And it's only a matter of time when you aren't going to see a lot of people out there, picking grapes or picking lettuce anymore. It's all going to be automated.
Right. And I mean, some of the equipment that they're buying for this purpose, I mean, look at the cost of a tractor. And for us, it's grape harvester. these things are pushing $1 million in many cases. I would imagine the IT part is a good investment to make sure they're getting the most usage out of those.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they invest. It's kind of interesting. I always used to say that when we did a lot of healthcare, we still do, but not as much as we used to. But I always used to say a doctor is happy to spend $1 million on an X-ray machine, but he balks at spending $5,000 a month on IT support. And that's because the X-ray machine has pretty direct ROI. If I do this many X-rays, I'm going to be able to make my money back in this many years. So we try to do the same sort of thing when we work with our ag clients in particular, to let them know that when they use us, they're investing in a future, and we can show them an ROI, because somebody has to manage that $1 million piece of equipment that they just had shipped in from the Netherlands. That's going to help them, pluck orchids just a little bit better than they were plucking it last time. And so we need to add value to that equation, or we really aren't going to be able to continue to work with them.
So you give me a lot of good background, Luis, on that. What challenges or other challenges did IoT present for you and your clients as you started implementing these solutions?
Well, I think the biggest challenge for us is that these are all still kind of niche solutions in the industry, in the ag industry. And so consolidation in that will help the industry start using more standardized technology, because right now what you see is a lot of one-offs. Somebody will come in and design a specific system for a specific greenhouse that's a little different than the one that they designed for the greenhouse down the street. And from a technology perspective, it presents some challenges, because now you have to adapt and create linkages to each one of these things that are different than the one that you created before. So more standardization in the industry, I think, will be helpful. And I think we're starting to see more traditional technology providers move into the IoT space, which means that will accelerate the adoption of these technologies in a more commercial fashion. I always say that my clients complain that they have a Nest at home and it works really well. Why can't they have a Nest in their office? Why do they have to have this complicated HVAC system that nobody knows how to operate? And whenever it breaks, you got to hire somebody at $200 an hour to come fix it. And there's justification for that. And as we start to see the commercial application of consumer technologies to make it easier for people to do their work and take care of business, if you will, I think there's going to be a ton of opportunity for technology solutions providers to just integrate all that technology. Because we started with my first company as a traditional systems integrator, and it's funny, we're heading back down that path into integrating all of these disparate technologies. Some of them that are traditional IT stuff, but a lot of them are brand new and not known to us. So I'm having a lot of fun learning about them.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned healthcare earlier as one of the verticals you work in, and I saw the IoT and healthcare markets expected to reach or exceed 500 billion by 2025. That's a global number, but that's a big number nonetheless. Other verticals are showing similar patterns of growth, the 20%, 25%. Some are a little lower at 15%, but generally, they're fully into the double digits. Even though we know that channel doesn't play typically in all of those different verticals. But what opportunities do you see for IoT applications in the MSP community?
Well, last year I attended an IoT summit at that Intel, a gentleman from Intel, Rick Lisa, spoke at. And he put up a slide that really struck me. And he said that by 2020, so this year, Intel expected the worldwide IoT opportunity to be over $1 trillion, of which 60% of that they saw as managed services. That is implementing and managing those technologies. Another 30% they saw in applications, developing applications that tie all these systems together, creating analytics around those things. And only about 10% was hardware, which Rick lamented, because that's what Intel does, is hardware. Right. So he says, this is not a big opportunity for Intel, but it's a great opportunity for the MSPs of the world who want to develop an IoT practice and specialize in an industry. That's what we did. We focused on ag, and that's paid off for us. And I think if somebody wanted to focus on the healthcare side of things, there's going to be opportunity there. If you want to focus on, smart cities is another thing that we're looking at, because we have a lot of smaller cities and towns in our area that don't have the capacity, let's say, of a San Jose or San Francisco, but they have as much interest in creating technology to help their citizens. They're interested in digital transformation, and that means using IoT related technologies to make the lives of their citizens better, and we want to be part of that journey. So that's the next step that we're moving into, is this whole concept of smart cities.
Very good. Now it seems like you're very forward thinking with where you're projecting your business will be. How have these type of advanced solutions, the IoT and cybersecurity, affected your business? And how do you think MSPs need to be following a similar suit?
Well, I think that it's never going to die, but the world of the traditional IT data center, at least in the SMB space, is rapidly disappearing. More and more of our clients are moving whatever workloads they have, whether they're things like email into Office 365 or Gmail, or their ERP vendors are hosting the ERP now, so that they don't need to be on-prem anymore. So if you're an MSP and you built your practice on babysitting servers and babysitting PCs, and you think that's going to last forever, I got bad news for you. It's disappearing pretty quickly, especially when you look at the workforce that we have today. I was reading an article last week regarding the coronavirus, and they were saying that unlike other potential pandemics, we're more prepared as globally for something like this than ever before, because so many of us have gotten used to working remotely. We've created this remote workforce, a mobile workforce, that lets you stay home and be just as productive as if you were in the office. So you aren't worried about what's a pandemic going to do when my people can't come to the office. It's like, great, now I don't have to buy donuts anymore. They can get their own donuts and work from home. And so that mobile workforce, cloud-based workforce, that means that we as MSPs need to adapt and adopt new technologies that are relevant, and that, obviously security, huge deal. We don't like to necessarily call ourselves a managed security services provider, but that's really what we are, because we focus on security first whenever we engage with clients. And IoT, there are going to be more edge devices out there than traditional PCs and laptops and servers. So they're going to need care and feeding too. You might as well learn how to do that.
Do you find that working in an emerging industry like, the cannabis, they're rewriting everything from the beginning? Does that give you kind of all, I shouldn't say carte blanche, but give you opportunity to go back and look, if I want to build a system from the ground up, here's the way to do it. And it can translate into some of your other clients as well. Is that what you're finding?
Absolutely. I mean, the cannabis industry has been fun for us, not just because it's super sexy, because cannabis is, new and fun.
Yeah.
But it is a brand new industry in California that is starting from nowhere. And as it has evolved and started to mature, even in the last 3 years, you're starting to see kind of the traditional, for lack of a better term, the traditional cannabis growers that were growing in their basement or, in their garage, and then said, okay, now I can buy a greenhouse and do it there. Now you're starting to see more sophisticated people come in to say, okay, how do we drive efficiencies into this? We can't throw money at it forever. So, how do we produce better product? How do we produce more consistent product? How do we market that product? And all of those are opportunities for us in a number of different places, all wrapped around traditional IT, but we're getting involved in digital signage, for example, for dispensaries. We're getting involved with point of sales and ERP systems, because the existing ones that are out there are just not scalable to the extent that the industry needs. So there's a lot of new people trying to build solutions and looking for partners to sell and market those solutions. So that's an opportunity for us. So we look at that and say, what other new industry is there out there that we can tap into? And that's why we're chasing the opportunity in this whole smart city thing, because we think that that's something that will be attractive to a lot of the people, a lot of the communities that we're serving already. And we can add a lot of value because they don't have the bandwidth to do it. They don't have the skill set or the capacity. So we can come in and help them with that.
That's interesting. So you've touched on a couple of the opportunities, but what in addition is next for your IoT practice within your MSP? How do you see these solutions evolving over the next 3 to 5 years? Just arbitrary number I'm throwing out there, but.
Yeah, well, one of the things we're doing is we've started to partner with a company called KMC Controls out of Chicago, and KMC is about 50 years old, and they've done traditional facilities management technology, things like HVAC systems and CO2 monitoring systems, all the stuff that you see in any commercial property whenever you walk into an office building. They're now developing a way to take all of the inputs of all these different systems and put them into a cloud-based platform that allows you to create an integrated portal to view all of the data that these systems are generating and start doing some analytics around it. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that's an area that has a huge potential, because we're generating more data than we know what to do with, but we're just storing it someplace because we don't know what to do with it. So the sooner we can get to the point where we can go to our clients, whether they're in the ag space, healthcare, or public entities, and say, hey, we can tie all this data together and show you actionable intel that will make your business better. That's a huge opportunity for us.
Yeah, it's an opportunity to show the ROI too. That's always the hardest thing, is we've got all of these opportunities and options on the technology side, but what does it mean for their bottom line? And the more information you have, the easier it'll be to be able to show that info. So provide us with a lot of great information, Luis, so far, but what recommendations do you have for your peers who are considering adding IoT applications to their portfolio?
I get asked that question a lot, and my answer is usually the same, which is look around your existing clients, the people that you're working with today, the industries that you're working with today, and ask yourself, what are they doing with IoT? It's kind of funny, because before we got into surveillance, for example, I walked around and never noticed cameras. Now I go into any building anywhere,
check them out.
The cameras going, oh no, those are old cameras. We can improve on that. So we don't know what we don't know, but once you start to look at what your clients are doing and talking to them, engaging with them on, do they have an IoT strategy? Obviously, if they don't know what you're talking about, it's an opportunity to educate them. But if they do, then chances are you want to be part of that. So learn what your clients are doing and then start there before you try to create something out of nothing.
That makes perfect sense. So it's been a fantastic discussion. I appreciate your time. Unfortunately, we're running low on time. So before we leave today, do you have any other final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, there's a lot of IoT resources out there. CompTIA has some good resources if you want to get smart on what is IoT and what are the opportunities. But educate yourself. Even if you don't want to start talking to your clients right now, it does you no harm to go out and learn about IoT and how you can create your own IoT practice potentially in the future.
Well, that's great advice. On behalf of IOTA, I'd like to extend a sincere thank you to Luis Alvarez of the Alvarez Technology Group for sharing his insight on IoT as well as the MSP community today. Be sure to stop back next Wednesday for the latest Secure Connections podcast. Have a secure and profitable day. Thank you.